Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 334, and today I'm joined by Dave DeCamp. Dave, how you doing?
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you. Of course, Dave has been on the show a bunch of times, but for anybody who's maybe a new listener, he is the news editor at antiwar.com and the host of Anti-War News, which is a really fantastic show covering news in foreign policy. So, Dave, let's just roll right into it here. And anybody who wants to find our work, check out antiwar.com. It's all there. Let's start with this one. Zelensky confirms Ukrainian counteroffensive has started. So what, as far as you're aware, is going on with this counteroffensive?
Yeah, so it seems to be in full swing now. It was early last week that Russia was reporting a lot of Ukrainian attacks, both in the eastern Donbass region and then in the south in the Zaporozhye Oblast. And it was pretty clear during that week that, some sort of offensive started, but Ukrainian officials weren't really commenting on it. But then over the weekend, Zelensky did confirm that the counteroffensive is underway. And, there's been more heavy fighting since then. Just about every day now, there's a lot of reports of Ukrainian attacks. Ukraine, they appear to have made some small gains, but at some of these villages that they've taken, then Russia came back and pushed them back out. So it just appears to be pretty heavy fighting. We haven't really seen the battle lines change much. And Russia's saying that they're destroying a lot of, they're using the NATO weapon. They're using German-made Leopard tanks, the American Bradley fighting vehicles, and all sorts of other armored vehicles that the U.S. and NATO have provided. So this is, a NATO-trained and equipped army launching this counteroffensive. So that's, where we're at right now. It seems like the battle is still going on.
Yeah, so it seems like there's quite a bit of fighting left to do. I saw the French president today say that they were expecting this to last weeks or months. I have seen some people who, I don't want to call them, pro-Russian or anything like that, but, definitely on the side of the conflict where they often, think that Russia is making gains, kind of declaring that the counteroffensive has been defeated. I saw a new article by Douglas McGregor today at the American Conservative that said, Ukraine has depleted a lot of their forces already. However, if they want to, they could, take assets from other region and use that for the counteroffensive. So, Dave, do you have any idea or what's, maybe your opinion on how this is going for Ukraine, and then how much of their equipment have they used up, and what do you think the future is here?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. And just judging by what Russia has been saying, it sounds like they've lost a few dozen, tanks and other armored vehicles. And they've been sent a lot of stuff, not just the Leopard tanks, but, again, a lot of these armored fighting vehicles. So I have a feeling that, again, this is just kind of based on me observing it. And I'm not sure exactly how sustainable these attacks are for Ukraine's forces. I just kind of have a feeling that this is going to be going on like this for a while now. This could drag out pretty long, I think, with these Ukrainian attacks. It doesn't seem like, they're definitely taking losses, but it doesn't sound like it's too huge. And they did have, at least, I believe 48,000 troops, trained by NATO for this offensive, and they probably have some more than that. So I think, this could drag out, throughout the summer at least.
Yeah. Now, I guess one thing I'll add is I know the fall counteroffensive, there were maybe a week of fighting where Ukraine didn't seem to make up very much ground. And then that turned out to be like a feint, and they were really attacking another region. One reason I don't think that's happening this time is I covered this probably a week or two ago. The Washington Post did like a profile of the 47th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine, and they were described by the Washington Post as the tip of the spear. These are all NATO-trained forces equipped almost entirely with NATO weapons. And if you're looking at the reports, even from some of the Ukrainian missions, it does seem like that brigade has taken some pretty significant losses on the ground. Dave, I guess, unless you have anything else on that, I'd like to move on here and start talking about the weapons that the West is going to give to Ukraine. It seems like every time they have a battlefield setback or, there's a long-standing period of stalemate, the West gets very, very concerned about arming up and making sure Ukraine has enough weapons. So, what are we seeing here? You have this article titled "Bipartisan Lawmakers Urge Biden to Send Longer Range Weapons to Ukraine."
Yeah, so the one thing that they're really pushing for, that a lot of the hawks have been pushing for, is these ATACMS, which are the missiles that the Ukraine could use with the HIMARS rocket systems that have a range of 190 miles. But another interesting thing in that letter that these members of Congress are asking Biden to do is expedite the shipment of the Abrams tanks. When the U.S. first announced that they were sending the Abrams in January, the original plan was to make new ones. It was going to take a few years for them to get them. But then the Pentagon changed the plans. They're refurbishing older Abrams tanks. And the idea is to get them to Ukraine, by the fall or before the end of the year. What these people are saying is, make it faster than that. They're trying to say, get these in Ukraine's hands right now so they can use them in this counteroffensive. So I think that might be a sign that they're worried that Ukraine is taking a lot of losses, losing a lot of equipment in this counteroffensive. And, they want to, just throw more weapons at the problem is what it seems like, even though the U.S. keeps announcing these new big weapons packages. But it just sounds like that's their antidote for everything, is to just promise more and commit more to this war. And back to kind of the counteroffensive, one thing that I thought was interesting, there's been a few reports. I know one from CNN, and I believe there's also one in the Washington Post, where U.S. officials were saying that, Ukraine is taking a lot of significant losses right now, and they're facing very stiff Russian resistance. So, the U.S. might have a realistic view on this counteroffensive. And again, in Congress, they just want to throw more weapons at the problem.
Right. All really important points, Dave. So I know just this morning you probably haven't gotten a chance to write this up yet, but they're talking about sending depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. So what do you know about that, just quickly?
Yeah, so this is just based on a Wall Street Journal report right now. It's saying that the U.S. it seems like they're going to go ahead and give Ukraine depleted uranium rounds with the Abrams tanks. And, these are toxic rounds that have a history of causing cancer and birth defects, mainly in Iraq. The U.S. used a lot of depleted uranium in the Gulf War, in the first Iraq War, and also, after the invasion. And there's still birth defects today in the city of Fallujah, likely because of this depleted uranium. And this is something that the British have sent already. And, Putin warned that they would respond to the British providing them with this depleted uranium. And then when he announced that he was sending nukes to Belarus, he said that it was in response to those depleted uranium rounds being sent to Ukraine. So it shows that I think Russia takes it pretty seriously. And, it's just another escalation. And it's possible that the U.S. has already sent these with the Bradley fighting vehicles, because they can be armed with depleted uranium. And the White House was asked about it, and they refused to answer. So there's a chance that they're already there on the battlefield. But again, this would kind of confirm that the U.S. would be providing Ukraine with these toxic rounds.
Right. And I did see just before we started recording here, the U.S. announced a new about $300 million security package to Ukraine, although I don't know what's in that yet. So we'll have to get to that on a show later in the week. But Dave, since you mentioned the nukes to Belarus, go ahead and talk about this article that you have here. Poland urges NATO response to Russia sending nukes to Belarus.
Yeah, so this is Poland's president, Andrzej Duda. Just basically, he's just said that NATO needs, to respond to Russia deploying nukes to Belarus. He didn't say what that response would be, although he's previously said that he wants the U.S., he wants to host U.S. nuclear weapons in Poland. And he said last year that he was actually in discussions on that issue with the U.S. And there's currently NATO U.S. nuclear weapons stored in 5 other NATO countries: Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. And there's no U.S. nukes in countries that joined NATO after the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think that could change. I think what the U.S. and NATO have been planning to do is really build up their forces in Eastern Europe And, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. does decide to take that step and send nukes to Poland in response to Russia sending nukes to Belarus. And, it's just we could kind of get in this cycle of escalation like that.
So, Dave, let's go back to the weapon shipments here and talk about the F-16s and what we know about the timeline for that. You have an article at antiwar.com yesterday, June 12th. Netherlands says Ukrainian pilots training on F-16s could start this summer.
Yeah, so that's the Netherlands defense minister saying that seems to be the goal, is to start the training in the summer, and summer is pretty close, so that means the training could start soon. And it's these European countries, they say that they're leading the way here. The Netherlands and Denmark, and I believe Belgium as well. They're the ones that are offering their F-16s to send them to Ukraine. And we don't know yet how many Ukraine's going to get or who exactly is going to be providing them. But right now, this is kind of how this is being presented, is as this European-led effort to arm and train Ukraine on these F-16s, although the U.S. obviously is also going to help out with the training. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see the U.S. end up, sending their own F-16s, because right now, Biden, what he approved was the delivery of F-16s from other countries. So, but again, when it comes down to it, and they actually make these plans to send these F-16s to Ukraine, I actually expect to see the U.S. also send some as well. Not just these European countries.
Right. And so you have in this article that the timeline is anywhere from 4 months up to 2 years. Do you have any, suspicions from, watching this, Dave, and kind of paying attention to the conflict of what you think the timeline might be here for the F-16s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's tough to say. And I know with other training, they've done it a lot quicker than, they expected. So I think they could probably do it, in the shorter time frame. And they said also, this was another report, a U.S. official was saying that, an experienced Ukrainian MiG pilot could learn how to fly the F-16s within 4 months. So it might be, I would say probably less than a year if I was going to guess. But still, this is a very long-term plan, getting these F-16s to Ukraine. So we're not going to see them, used on the battlefield for probably like 2 years, I would guess. And, there's a big question with that. It's who's going to maintain the F-16s once they get over there? Is there going to be Pentagon contractors? And I think that could be another level of escalation.
Yeah, another point I read on the timeline, Dave, was it depends on what you want to use them for. If you just want to use them for dropping bombs, and my understanding with how they're using the JDAMs with extended ranges right now is, they're flying the planes low, then they're dipping up and releasing the weapons. And so maybe that takes a less amount of training than, say, training a pilot to engage in dogfighting, land on aircraft carrier, something a little bit more complicated like that. But as you say, I think the logistical issues here, how are you going to refuel and maintenance these planes, are probably really important. Let's move on here and talk about the upcoming NATO Summit that me and you have been spending a lot of time covering at antiwar.com. And there's membership for 2 countries on the table here, Ukraine and Sweden. Let's talk Ukraine first. So you have this article, U.S. ambassador says Ukraine unlikely to get invite to join NATO. And Dave, I thought this was interesting because for the past couple of months, the U.S. Has been careful not to say that they, didn't think Ukraine would join NATO or get an invite. They were just saying it would be up to the alliance.
Yeah. And there's been, so many reports about this. It seems to be still an ongoing debate within the alliance. What are they going to promise Ukraine at this summit in Vilnius this July? And, from based on just reports, the U.S. was against the idea of giving them, a roadmap to membership, which is, what some of the more hawkish NATO countries like Poland and Estonia want to do. So yeah, this is the first time the U.S. is really publicly commenting on it like this. But I think there is an agreement that this isn't going to happen. It seems like that Ukraine's not actually going to get, a formal invitation to join NATO. Now, the question is, the thing Zelensky says, he's saying he's going to boycott the summit if he doesn't get a promise that Ukraine can join the alliance after the war. But again, I think that he's going to have difficulty getting that promise. So it's a big question: is what is the U.S. and NATO going to promise Ukraine at this summit? The Israel model seems to be the most popular idea, which would mean lots of military aid, but no Article 5 style mutual defense guarantee. Macron is calling for something, greater than somewhere in between an Israel model and a full NATO membership. So whatever that looks like. But either way, I mean, it just shows, and especially from what Blinken's been saying recently, that they're thinking very long term, and they're going to give. This is going to be a pretty pivotal summit, I think, that they're going to give Ukraine some kind of new commitment, and all it's going to do is just mean that this drag out this war, prolong this thing, because we know, Russia's main demand is Ukrainian neutrality, and this goes completely against that, of course.
Right. Yeah. I guess, there's a lot of questions here. And, the whole lead up to the summit has been very interesting, as there's been a lot of members of the NATO alliance who wanted, Ukraine to get this path to membership. And, Ukraine has been pushing really hard for it as well. Dave, I do wonder if Ukraine would maybe feel some incentive to negotiate an end to the war if they were guaranteed NATO membership at the end of the process. And it does seem like the U.S. strategy is really bent on keeping Ukraine fighting here. And so, all they're going to offer Ukraine at the summit is a lot more weapons. It really seems to be the case here. And, years and years of commitment of weapons. They're talking about making sure Ukraine has multiple Patriot air defense systems, F-16, modern fighting forces, NATO standard weapons. I mean, this is probably hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons that they're talking about providing Ukraine. It's going to take years. So quickly, I want to ask you, what do you think the prospects are right now for any kind of negotiations here? And, kind of what is the Biden administration trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think, the prospects for negotiations are very slim. Yeah, I don't really have any hope for it at this point because, like I said, Russia is looking at this. Like you mentioned, would Ukraine settle for some sort of negotiation if they were able to become, a member of NATO? That's something Russia obviously wouldn't go for right now. I think right now, Russia, time is kind of on their side, and they're seeing all this from NATO and from the U.S. that, just doesn't give them any reason to really stop. And as long as the Biden administration is completely backing Ukraine the way it is and opposing peace talks, opposing the idea of a ceasefire, the current leadership in Ukraine, Zelensky and all of his top guys, they're all in on this war just as much as, the U.S. is. They can't settle for anything less than what their demands are. I think their leadership would be threatened if they ultimately gave up on this war. So they have an interest in keeping it going. And so it just seems, I think this thing is going to drag out for years now. It's just the way I see it. Absent a big change in the U.S. policy, of just backing this open-ended conflict. I think some people in Congress might be looking to kind of dial back the amount of money that they're spending on Ukraine as they want to focus on China. And I think they are kind of hoping for like a frozen conflict, maybe like a demilitarized zone. That's something that they definitely favor, but so they could still, send military aid to Ukraine and keep this kind of NATO bulwark on Russia's border. But then again, on Russia's side, I don't see them going for any sort of thing like that because they know that the U.S. and NATO have very long-term designs on supporting Ukraine. So I think they probably think they can exhaust the U.S. and NATO, and they're digging in for a long war, it seems like.
Right. And that's a great point because to scale back support for Ukraine could mean the crumbling of the Ukrainian army. We've seen that the U.S. has really had to escalate the amount and the, how advanced the support they give Ukraine is. If they dial that back, can Ukraine even keep fighting, or do they need F-16s to be able to repel the Russian forces at this point? I guess let's move on here, Dave, and talk about Sweden and the potential for Swedish membership in NATO. It looks like Stockholm did approve the extradition of somebody, and this could be a motivator for Ankara to lift its opposition.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if come, when the summit happens, which I think it's going to be held from July 7th to the 10th, by then, if Turkey approves Sweden's membership, because now that Erdogan won his election, seems like the U.S. and NATO are kind of pushing him now to approve Sweden from to join the alliance. And their big thing with Sweden is that they say that there's these, PKK members there, and they want to extradite them. And Sweden has approved the extradition of this guy who apparently was arrested in Turkey on a drug charge, and he's kind of being extradited under the guise of this because of a drug charge. But it's pretty clear that it's because he supports. He said himself that he has expressed support for the PKK, and that's what this is really about. And Sweden's also passed this new anti-terror law. The only thing is, there's been protests against all this inside Sweden, but I don't really know how big they are. Against, they're not people aren't happy that Turkey is targeting Kurds in Sweden, and the Swedish government is trying to placate Turkey. But yeah, I think we should expect to see them to ultimately get approved soon. Hungary still needs to approve Sweden. I don't really know exactly what they're waiting on. I know they had some issues with the Swedish government, kind of criticizing the Orban government in Hungary, but I think they might time it with Turkey, to approve it soon as well.
Yeah, that's kind of why I figure is Hungary's position is they would rather not upset Russia by voting for this, but they're not going to be the last NATO member to hold out. So as long as they could be number 30 of 31, then that's kind of where they're going to sit, I think, as far as Hungary goes. Now, I do know I guess, protests in Sweden outside the Turkish embassy got pretty severe, where the people were burning Qurans and things like that. So, and that really upset Turkey. So, I'm not sure how much opposition there is or how much it makes a difference in Sweden. I just don't know that much about the politics, but thanks for that update, Dave. Now, I guess we got one more article here kind of on potential negotiations and dealing with how the U.S. feels about any kind of diplomacy here. And we have members of Congress want to punish South Africa for relations with Russia. And you just wrote this one today, Dave. So what's going on here?
Yeah, so South Africa has been neutral in the war in Ukraine, and of course that upsets the U.S. And they've been accused of providing Russia with military equipment. There was a sanctioned Russian ship docked in South Africa last December, and the U.S. is claiming, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa went public with these accusations, which just shows what kind of diplomats the U.S. has, claiming that, they were loading military equipment onto the Russian ship, saying that South Africa, supports Russia's war in Ukraine. But, there's no evidence to back this up. It's just an accusation. But South Africa has done some other things that, again, anger the U.S. They did joint military drills with China and Russia earlier this year. They apparently allowed a Russian plane to land in an airport. I don't really understand why, the U.S. has a very skewed view of neutrality. I don't think they really know what it's supposed to mean. But if a country's neutral, I don't get why they're supposed to go along with sanctions and everything. But yeah, so that's what this seems to be about, is they're just, unhappy that South Africa is not going along with everything. So this few members of Congress sent this letter to the Biden administration, and they want South Africa is going to be hosting this annual summit that's held between African countries and the U.S. each year under this trade law. It's basically a trade summit, and they don't want South Africa to host it. They want to punish them by moving it. And I think more long term, they want to look at changing the trade relationship with South Africa if, they're still not falling in line as much as the U.S. wants them to. Another big thing is the BRICS summit. So South Africa is supposed to be hosting a BRICS summit, and it seems like there's some political factions in the country that want them to execute the arrest warrant of Putin under the ICC. But for the most part, I think the government, they're going to try to accommodate having the summit with, and allowing Putin to go there and not have to worry about the threat of being arrested. Or there's actually talk that they might move the summit, I think maybe to China, or I forget where else they could go, but in another country that, Putin's not going to have to worry about this ICC arrest warrant.
Right, and then I guess it's also worth knowing that Africa as a continent has worked to put forward, I guess, an effort to end the war in diplomacy, in one of the leading partners, and that is South Africa. Dave, you have this article, real fresh article here. I guess this happened last night, Monday night. A U.S. helicopter had some kind of issue in Syria. So what's going on with this one?
Yeah, so CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, announced on Monday night that there was a helicopter mishap in northeast Syria that injured 22 U.S. troops. And this incident took place on Sunday. They didn't say much, they didn't share really any details. They said that they're investigating the cause and that there was no enemy fire reported. So that's basically all Central Command said. But on that same day, there were reports of a U.S. helicopter raid in northeast Syria in al-Hasaka, which is the northeast province in Syria. And Syrian state media reported that U.S. forces killed a civilian in this raid. But I didn't really see that anywhere else. And there's also, if you know, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, they're based in the UK. They're very anti-Assad government. And their reports are, very different sometimes. Sometimes they confirm, what's coming from the state media. But in this case, they didn't. They did report this airdrop operation by the U.S. in that northeastern province. And they're claiming that a person was killed, but that they were affiliated with ISIS. So it seems like conflicting reports about who was killed. From my experience, this is from Syria's state news agency, SANA, SANA. From my experience, they don't tend to exaggerate or make up civilian casualties, that news agency. So I would lean more toward the chance that a civilian was killed in this raid. But so far, we haven't seen any confirmation that this even happened from U.S. Central Command or any claim, any other reports about it, really. But when it comes to CENTCOM, they've been doing a lot of anti-ISIS operations in Syria, and they don't report every single one. Sometimes they just put out a monthly summary, and they never, even if they're accused of killing civilians, it's rare that they'll only admit it if they have to.
All right, Dave, let's wrap up here and give us the latest news on the alleged Chinese spy base in Cuba.
Yeah, so this started with a Wall Street Journal report last week that said China and Cuba agreed in principle to allow a Chinese surveillance station to be set up in Cuba where the Chinese could spy on the U.S. And of course, this set off just like a frenzy from the China hawks in Congress. It seemed to me like it was coordinated to get them to pressure Blinken to cancel his plans again to visit China. But it was weird. So the day that the Wall Street Journal report came out, both the White House and the Pentagon said the report was not accurate. Then over the weekend, a Biden administration official who spoke to the media, unnamed official, said that China has spying capabilities in Cuba, and they were improved in 2019. So it's kind of a weird claim made by this official. And so then China just basically came back and said, this is inconsistent information, and called it all lies and say that they're trying to smear China. But the real, thing about it is just the reaction. You see kind of the frenzy and the hysteria that people in Congress are put in when it comes to China. I put a quote in there from Bob Menendez saying that if China is trying to establish a surveillance station in Cuba, it's an assault on the United States. And obviously, if China is looking to do something like that, the U.S. really shouldn't be surprised, because the U.S. has all sorts of surveillance capabilities against China. They're always flying surveillance flights over the South China Sea, pretty close to China's coast. There was a U.S. plane just 30 miles off the Chinese coast the other day. That's closer than Cuba is to Florida. And also, they have intelligence capabilities in Taiwan. It's not really clear exactly what they have there, but they might have something like this spying facility the U.S. is claiming China has or is setting up in Cuba. Again, it's not exactly clear what the allegation is now. And also, the U.S. helps India spy on Chinese troops on their disputed border in the Himalayas. So, you just shouldn't be surprised if China is looking to do something like this. So Yeah, and it looks like Blinken is still planning to go to China, although the Chinese Foreign Ministry wouldn't confirm because there were reports that he was going to go on June 18th, and China hasn't confirmed it yet. So we'll see. But it's just the rhetoric is just talking about China now.
Yeah, I agree, Dave, and I think that's one of the really unfortunate things, kind of what we deal with in the current foreign policy political climate is at one point, I think there was probably an acceptance that this was statecraft. This was state level espionage that happens. And look, I'm a libertarian. I don't love it, but at the same time, I acknowledge that it exists and that if the United States is going to do it, conduct all these surveillance flights off China's coast, then China's going to do things as well. And that doesn't mean that this is necessarily happening in Cuba, but some level of Chinese surveillance is certainly going on of the U.S., especially, military sides, anything they see as strategic. And so for that to constantly be weaponized as a narrative against any kind of diplomacy, any kind of discussions is so problematic. And we see this time and time again with Russia, China, and Iran. I think they often use this kind of tactic where Iran does something that is well within what happens in the Middle East as far as, kind of regional geopolitical games that these different countries play, supporting a Syrian militia or something like that. And it's used to try to kill any talks between the U.S. and China or Iran. So, Dave, any final thoughts? If not, tell people where to find your work.
Yeah, all my articles are at antiwar.com. You can listen to the podcast Anti-War News. And you can follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave. Those are all the ways to find me.
All right, Dave, thank you so much. And just a reminder, check out antiwar.com. I watch Dave's show on the site, like on the homepage every morning. It's kind of featured in the corner, a real nice video feed right there. But there's plenty of ways to check it out. Dave, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kyle.